Hello, all. Welcome to the Cabot Water Stewardship Nature-Based Solution and Blended Finance webinar. We are due to start in a minute, so I'll just hang fire before we do any housekeeping questions and introductions to the team. But we are due to start in approximately 1 minute. Just seeing numbers coming in. So we've got 15 registered so far. So actually about 250 people registered for this webinar. I'll be surprised if we get quite so many, but we'll give everyone another minute or so to join. Okay, according to my clock, that's 12 o'clock. So again, welcome to this catchment-based approach webinar on water stewardship, nature-based solutions and blended finance. We are here for an hour today. We've got a lot of ground to cover, some really interesting topics, some very detailed and rich topics. So really, this is going to be a relatively high-level overview. We intend to do probably about 40 minutes or so of presentations and leaving plenty of time for question and answers. If you do have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A function. We will be pausing on occasion to take some of those questions. But as I say, we're going to be leaving hopefully a good 15 minutes at the end to go through most of them. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce the team and line up the slides. So if anyone does have any issues with hearing, you can do the captions function. Just click CC on the bottom of the toolbar and then show the subtitles. So that's will come through. As I say, if you can please submit any questions via the Q&A function, we'll do our best to run through those at the end and try and answer any of the questions that you have. And please note that this is being recorded. Just final bit of housekeeping, I suppose, as an introduction to the team. So my name's Alex Adam. I'm Deputy Director of Strategy and Stewardship at the Rivers Trust, and I'm joined by my rather exceptional colleagues. So Seren, Tom and Dan, who you can see on the right. They'll introduce themselves as they just tee up their sessions. But for now, I'm going to run you through a few slides by way of, sort of introduction and framework of some of the work that the team have been doing really over the last 3 or 4 years. So first slide is the river veins mapped, which I'm sure many of you have seen many times before, particularly if you've seen any of my presentations. And I always like to start with these presentations because our overall approach and the framing of the work that you're about to hear about is all done around the catchment-based approach. It is recognizing that as the Rivers Trust, we are all about happy, healthy rivers. We can only have happy, healthy rivers if we work at a catchment scale, because everything that happens on the land ultimately ends up in our rivers. And in order to achieve our charitable objectives, we need to work collaboratively with people across the catchment from all sectors, all industries, all walks of life to help overall improve the health and status of our rivers. I think this map also does a really good job of sort of illustrating the fact that water is a critical part of not just our river network, but our society, our environment. It is the veins, it's the thing that kind of links us all, both business, environment, society. We are all bound and together around water and catchments. So just bear that in mind as we go through these slides today. Again, in terms of water, and I guess many people on this call will be very familiar with some of the challenges we're facing, but in short, when you start to think about water stress, they're often categorized as too much, too little, or too dirty. And I think the situation we've had over the last 3-4 years with both droughts, with floods, with water quality issues, both from sewage outlets and overflows and the public outrage around that, but also agricultural pollution, etc. I think it really illustrates some of the challenges that we are facing. And to my mind, at least, I think if we are going to adapt to a changing climate and the crisis that is causing, that's best done through the medium of water. And if you want to enable change and bring people along and deliver that collective action, you can do that through water and the medium of catchments, because not least because that helps you manage the environment as a system, but it also makes it real and tangible to many people. So I'll just really do a very quick slide around water stewardship. Again, this is a concept that's been around for a very, very long time, actually kind of referenced in the Bible, albeit not in water stewardship terms. But it's about how do we manage the water that we are also dependent upon. And this theory of change, this framework around water stewardship is something that's really been in development really about the last 15 20 years, primarily driven through WWF, but the Nature Conservancy, other major NGOs, kind of the leading edge of developing this theory of change. But it's become more and more pertinent and relevant to businesses, and actually I think provides a very useful common framework and indeed shared language to bring together what otherwise might be disparate audiences, so NGO sector, business sector, regulators, finances. It does actually provide a very useful language and a framing to bring all these people together around a common interest. So in terms of water stewardship, what is the theory? First of all, starts about thinking about water. This applies to any business organization, but you've got to start to think, where does the water in my taps come from? Then from a business perspective, but in towns or society, understand what the impact and risks might be associated with water, be that reputational risk, operational risk, resilience risk. So, what does drought mean in terms of supply chains? How do we keep our shelves stocked? How do we keep the water going in our factories? How do we prevent flooding to stopping people coming into our factories? So once you start to understand the impact and risk, again at a catchment scale, you start to think about what does the internal action look like? What can we be done at the factory gate? Now, those 3 steps are relatively straightforward and there's a well-defined methodology. And then you start to move into this collective action space, because it's all about the context and place. No matter how big you are as an organization, you cannot fix those issues associated with water unless you work with others in your catchment area. And that's obviously where there's a really key synergy with the likes of the catchment-based approach, catchment plans, and certainly in the UK, in England anyway, we're hugely fortunate that we have 105 or so catchment partnerships across the country. We have different catchment plans and different stages of maturity. We are beginning to bridge that gap between biodiversity and water. So that provides a really useful framework. And then the final step is influence and governance. So again, collectively bringing all those people together. How do we change governance, rules, regulations to provide that resilience and benefit the environment in ways that we all want and indeed need? There we go. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Saren, who's going to talk you through some of the work that we've been doing in terms of driving forward, I suppose, payment for ecosystem services and different forms of metrics.
Thanks, Alex, and hi everyone. So my name's Saren Patterson and I'm Water Stewardship Manager at the Rivers Trust. So my colleague Alex has kind of explained the theory of water stewardship, but what does that actually look like in practice? So this map really highlights all of the activities and interventions that we've got ongoing across the UK at the moment. So you can see that we work across several different catchments with lots of different types of businesses as well. But essentially concentrating on that collective action piece and what does it look like for a company to look outside of their factory gate and work directly with their catchments. What we do as the Central Rivers Trust is work with the local Rivers Trust to really identify where these opportunities are, where we're going to have the most impact across that area. So I'll go into some kind of key concrete examples later in the presentation, but I really just wanted to highlight in this presentation the different types of projects that we've got ongoing, and also the different types of businesses that we work with as well. So no matter what type of business you are, you usually use water somewhere, either that's in your direct operations or potentially through your supply chain. So most commonly, we work with a lot of food and drink businesses, but we also work with the IT sector. And again, this can be quite surprising because you could think, what does the IT sector going on the internet, streaming a service, what's that got to do with water? And mainly that's because they've got a lot of data cooling centres around the UK as well. So it's quite surprising sometimes the businesses that we do work with. But essentially, our core principle when we come to looking at water stewardship activities across the UK is making sure that these projects are addressing those key catchment issues. Next slide, please, Alex. So essentially, when we're working with a business, the kind of core principle is, well, how do we demonstrate impact across the projects that we're delivering? And then this comes to, what does replenish mean? And essentially, it's a brand name for the volumetric water benefit accounting methodology. So essentially, this methodology really helps businesses put a numerical value to the activities they're carrying out across the interventions that we're delivering. This then helps provide further investment into those projects. So for example, if a business has a very clear water stewardship strategy with a number associated to the volumes of water they've committed to replenish to the environment, we can then assess our activities and make sure that they're actually creating impact on the ground and meeting those targets. Next slide, please. But what is the methodology and what does it do? So essentially, it has a number of different land conservation and land cover restoration activities associated with a calculation embedded within the methodology that you can then essentially look at any wetland or river restoration activity you're doing and associate that with a numerical value. So what's really important for us is the kind of land conservation methodology, which is right at the start, and the curve number method associated with this. So this means, again, that when we implement a wetland or any kind of activity, that we can associate that with a numerical value. And essentially, when you first start to look at this methodology, it can be quite overwhelming. There's lots of different methods for lots of different interventions. And if you're a new Rivers Trust or a new person looking at this for the first time, it can be very complicated. So essentially, as the Rivers Trust, what we've been trying to do is break down the methodology into a simple to use calculator. So this means that you could essentially look at essentially a land use change that you're interested in implementing. So again, this could be anything from a wetland to introducing a cover crop. They'll all have a replenish value associated with that intervention. You can then input your data into the calculator and it will draw real-time rainfall data and have a look at what that intervention on the ground would then actually deliver. And essentially, this is all done using a friendly interface on an Excel spreadsheet. And it just kind of pulls out some of the complexities in terms of if you're very new to this area and it's quite taxing to kind of go through the methodology and pull out those calculations. This calculator that we've developed actually does that for you. So all you need to know is exactly what you want to deliver on the ground. We're hoping that this means that local rivers trusts will then be able to develop and implement their replenish values a lot quicker than they would have done. And then we're hoping that this is obviously going to generate more investment into the interventions needed on the ground. Next slide, please. So this is the calculator that we've developed. This is the interface that you would see as a local rivers trust when you first kind of land on this page. This calculator is still very much in development. So we launched the first phase of this a couple of years ago, which we verified and discussed with a company called Limnatech, who were first involved with developing the volumetric water benefit accounting methodology. Since then, we've actually received some further funding through the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund to develop this calculator further and make it far more easy to use for the local rivers trusts involved in the projects. And as I said, so this is a pilot phase at the moment of the news phase of the calculator, and I'll go into a little bit about the NERF project in a couple of slides' time. But essentially, I really just wanted to highlight that by making it easier to generate these replenish calculations, we are then making it easier for businesses to start to understand what that impact means in terms of a numerical value on the ground. Next slide, please. But again, so what does all of this look like in practice? Essentially, the calculations mean nothing without the actual interventions on the ground. So I'm just going to go through a quick case study that we've developed with Amazon Web Services. So we've been working with Action for the River Kennet. So these are in the Thames Basin. And we've built 2 wetlands, so Wilton and Fifield wetlands. And I'm going to start with Fifield. So essentially, Amazon Web Services came to us and they already had a very well-defined water stewardship plan and commitments to replenish water used within their data cooling centres, of which some are located within the Thames Basin. Action for the River Kennet already had well-established relationships with landowners in their catchment, and they'd also already started to design these wetlands that fit within the catchment-based approach plans. And essentially what we did with Amazon is essentially we match-make the two. So we knew that these projects were needed. They were identified by the catchment as a priority, and as Amazon really wanted to invest in water improvements in this area. So what this beautiful partnership created is, first of all, this Fifield wetland. And again, so this is a treatment wetland. So you can see the image on the left-hand side. That's the river course that before the wetland was introduced. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that there's the road going up along the image there, and that there's a new wetland built so that essentially when all of the road runoff flows down from that steep bank there, it will now go into this new treatment wetland, which will then flow into the watercourse. And if you go to the next slide, please, Alex. So this is some aerial footage. So once the video starts playing, you'll see that essentially this was just a grass field before, located in Wilton in Wiltshire. And essentially the area adjacent to this had severe flooding. So a series of wetland cells were built. So this is a storage wetland. So these images were actually taken before the wetland had been planted. So this is actually including no reeds or any kind of holding vegetation. They were constructed last winter, and this footage was taken in February. So you can see that even without the vegetation being planted, they're already holding a lot of water and already kind of creating a difference for that area. So these are the 2 wetlands that Amazon Web Services have invested in, and essentially both of these will have replenish values, and then Amazon are able to then take those figures and then offset them against the water that they abstract from this catchment. Next slide, please. So essentially, where do we go next? The projects that I highlighted on the first slide, these are obviously initial projects that we have been running through our water stewardship service. But how can we generate more interest and more investment into local catchments to make this more of a reality? And essentially what we really want to do is standardise the process. So as I mentioned, through some funding through NERF, what we've developed is essentially a standardized system for us to then take local catchment plans and then match them up with business interests. So again, if we start right at the top of this wheel, so local environment requirements identified and fed into catchment plans. So that's the #1 priority for us. We want to make sure that any intervention that we create on the ground feeds into wider plans and is answering a bigger problem or challenge. The next piece of the puzzle is then actually identifying what's the best nature-based solution for that problem. So that could be tree planting, it could be wetland creation, it could be educating landowners and farmers on interventions that they could do themselves to store more water. And it's making sure then that everyone is agreed and that we can move forward with that intervention. And obviously a big part of that is engaging lots of different partners. So this could be landowners, it could be local authorities, but essentially what we want is everyone agreed on that plan. Once we've got an intervention in mind, we've got our partners on board, we then want to generate that replenish value, because that's the hook that we really see businesses being interested in, so they can then look at if that replenish value is going to help them on their water stewardship journey. And again, when we're engaging with businesses and taking a water stewardship approach, the businesses we work with have to have operations in that catchment. So for example, a business who operates, let's say in Wiltshire, wouldn't be able to purchase or look at a replenish project up in Scotland where they don't have any operations. You need to be looking at the catchment where you're working, which obviously then correlates back to the slide that Alex showed, looking at that water stewardship ladder. It's all done on a catchment-based approach. So once the replenish values have been estimated, we'll then create a project summary, and this will be done by the local Rivers Trust. So all of these projects are led locally by those trusts. And essentially what we want to happen then is these projects be uploaded to a holding area where we can then basically have a library of projects ready to go and match with businesses when they approach us or we approach them. So once the projects have been submitted to us, we obviously just need to verify them to make sure that they do have sufficient plans behind them. And then verified projects can then be advertised and discussed with potential buyers. So these are the businesses. But before a business can invest or start this discussion with us, we do need to go through a due diligence process. So we need to make sure that they're wanting to invest in these projects for the right reasons. Once we're happy that their intentions are genuine and that we're sure that there's no greenwashing occurring, we can then discuss what projects would be most suitable. Once we've identified a project, we'll support with the contracting process to make sure that these are all in place. We'll also make sure that they're happy with the replenish values. So again, when we estimate the replenish values at the start of the project, this might not be the replenish value we end up once we've gone through that design and implementation process. So obviously we have to communicate that to all partners and make sure they're aware of the different risks involved. And then we go ahead and implement the project. So as you can see from the last slide, we'll go ahead, we will build the wetland, we'll conduct the river restoration activity, anything that's involved will then go ahead. And then obviously we'll implement a monitoring strategy to make sure that the replenish values are being generated. And this can be done through lots of different ways, through water quality testing, or if you're looking at storage, we can do that through imagery, rainfall data, etc. But it's basically just adding a bit of rigor and verification to the figures that we've provided. And then we can start right at the top of the circle, involving a new business, new projects, etc. So that's the standard process that we've come up with. And Alex, if you just move to the next slide, we're verifying this process through our two different groups. So we've got a technical seller advisory group. So these are the local Rivers Trusts that we're working with to make sure we're including everything that's needed within our standardized system. And then we've also got our buyer advisory group as well. So these are the corporates that we've already been working with, and we're already helping them along their water stewardship journey. And we just want to make sure that moving forward, we're encompassing all of their feedback as well, so we can make sure we've got a holistic approach. Next slide. And then, yes, lastly, I just wanted to look at the template that we'll be using. So anyone who is interested in submitting a replenish project, so these are usually the local Rivers Trusts, they can then fill in this template that we've created on the project. So this just gives a project summary, some pictures of the site. And again, they can be at lots of different levels. You can literally submit a project that's essentially ready to go, very similar to what we had with the Amazon and Action for the River Kennet example, where they had an idea of the interventions that were needed, but they just needed that investment to get it going. Or it could be even before this, even if it's just an idea that they actually want to explore further with their catchment groups or with other partners. That's also something that we're encouraging to submit. So I'll pause there to see if we've got any questions in the Q&A. I think, Alex, you were going to have a little look.
Thank you, Saren. Yeah, just a reminder to everyone to use the Q&A as opposed to the chat. It just makes life a bit easier. There are a few questions that have come in. So one was around the replenish methodology. Can we post it? We've got our hands a bit full at the moment, but you can easily find it by a bit of a quick Google search. It's peer-reviewed methodology published on the Water Resources Institute website. So I suggest you have a look there. Questions around whether the slides will be available. I'm not sure we'll have the slides, but the recordings will definitely be available and hosted on the Cabal website. A number of questions have come in. I think Amy's posed one about the calculator and whether is the calculator going to be available over and above beyond Rivers Trust. At this stage, as Saren's already alluded, we are it's very much work in progress. So we are working our way through that. And so it's just going to be with Rivers Trust and a select few at this stage. As I say, the methodology is widely available to all, but at this stage, we're going to just keep the calculator within the Rivers Trust because it's evolving and changing quite rapidly. What other questions? I think we've had a question around verification, which I know you've touched on, but might come back to that. Good question from Kate about information on how farmers are rewarded. We'll wait to come back to that Dan's session at the end, because that's how we're stacking all this together. And again, Richard's question about BNG and how this aligns. Again, I think that's probably a really very smooth segue onto Tom's session, who's going to look at some of the wider, should we say, ecosystem service metrics that we're looking at stacking and indeed blending to make this all a reality. So on that note, I'll be quiet and hand over to Tom.
Well, thank you, Alex and Saren. Yeah, I'm going to take us on a whistle-stop tour through some of the available markets at the minute, starting with biodiversity net gain. So from November, it's going to be mandatory for developers to provide a 10% biodiversity uplift, and this can be either on-site or provided through off-site habitat creation and restoration projects where biodiversity credits can be sold. So preparing for BNG, it's important to consider biodiversity net gain early in the project lifecycle, thinking about that feasibility, getting the baseline study surveys down, and then moving into the design, the delivery, and monitoring plans, which for BNG is a 30-year monitoring and maintenance requirement. The biodiversity metric 4 is how, at the moment, biodiversity net gain is quantified. This is provided by Natural England, and it's a real important component to try and understand that biodiversity metric. And quite a useful exercise that I found, you could do a practice desk-based study using sort of the magic maps the government's provided to do a baseline of a local site, or if you're a sad case like me, you could even go out and do a practice baseline, just understand and use the metric. The best way to understand it is by using it. And that ties into as well this conversation around enhancing habitat and creating habitat. At the moment, biodiversity net gain is targeted towards enhancing habitat rather than creating. So thinking about that in the design process of these projects, and also having a flexibility in design, maybe running a few different scenarios through the metric to calculate which is having the greatest uplift according to the metric. Also funding, so there's a big conversation around funding BNG projects at the moment. It's not possible for public grants to be used, but there is a conversation about a possible clawback clause, but there's guidance coming on that. So also thinking about how to fund these projects. And also pricing biodiversity net gain units. So biodiversity net gain projects are a massive undertaking. And there's also that 30-year monitoring and maintenance requirement. All of these things have to be considered and priced into a biodiversity net gain unit. And this can be eased by using catchment partnerships or farm clusters and through economies of scale and multiple projects over a larger area, making BNG slightly more feasible. And this could tie into habitat banking, so creating habitat banks within catchment partnerships. And there's currently no limit on how long you can bank these habitat units. So linking biodiversity net gain and the catchment-based approach, I think these two things link so nicely together. For BNG to be a success, we need to be taking a landscape scale approach, so delivering high quality biodiversity net gain for the benefit of the catchment, improving that habitat connectivity, creating these biodiversity corridors, and also knowledge sharing, not just within your own organizations, but cross-sector, cross-organization collaboration. So working out who else is delivering biodiversity net gain within your catchment, what sort of habitats are they providing, and then that sort of information can be tied into your design to make sure that we're all aiming towards the same goal, which ultimately we are wanting to benefit catchments and nature in general. And also there's a wealth of training opportunities out there. So to deliver river BNG, you have to be accredited within MORPH surveys. So getting the correct training to be able to perform river BNG. UK HAB has a good training system, and that's the preferred classification system used in the metric. And also the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management quite often has webinars. There's one on the metric coming next month, which is free. So definitely worth checking out if you're involved in BNG projects. Next slide, please. So nutrient neutrality, this is another compliance market brought about by the UK government, and it requires a zero net increase in nutrient levels from new plans or projects within catchments of sites protected under the Habitats and Species regulations. So these are special areas of conservation, special protection areas, and Ramsar sites. And each of these effective catchments has a nutrient budget calculator, which is used to calculate the excess nutrient loads from a development. And then this must be mitigated either on-site through sustainable urban drainage or off-site through nature-based solutions. And the Rivers Trust has done previous work on constructive wetlands. So there's a constructive wetlands framework, which is done for Natural England, and the constructive wetlands hub. So if your catchment partnership is looking at employing some of these constructive wetland systems, these are a really good place to start. They've got great information on design and feasibility. Next slide, please. So nutrient neutrality currently applies to 23 local rivers trusts and 25 CABA partnerships. And there are lots of ways to identify opportunities in the catchment where mitigations might be best placed. This could be through SIMAP diffuse pollution maps, identifying critical source areas within the catchment, which are likely to be where mitigation methods are likely to be most effective, and also using the CABA data packages, so things like SAGES opportunities for P reduction, consented discharges to controlled waters, identifying areas where nutrient loads are likely to be high, and therefore mitigation is likely to be most effective. You can also use FarmScoper, which is a tool that's able to model diffuse pollution from agricultural sources. So running FarmScoper at a catchment scale can help you identify WFD water bodies, which according to the model have the highest nutrient loads, and then targeting interventions within those water bodies. And also monitoring plans. So if your catchment partnership has got monitoring plans, using the data collected on water quality and feeding that into models to train them to improve the accuracy. For instance, you can use observations on water quality within the SIMAP model. There's also a rapid assessment methodology we've used for offline ponds. So this is a way of estimating nutrient loads to offline ponds and then estimating the nutrient reduction that's possible from them. And it takes into account the upstream area, so the drainage basin draining into that pond, then looks at rainfall, soil drainage type, land use, farm type, FarmScoper export coefficients, and then applies a removal efficiency rate from the literature to estimate a nutrient reduction. And there's lots of work being done in this space at the minute. The more data that we have available to us, the more accurately we'll be able to predict the way that these nature-based solutions work in this space. Next slide, please. So another water quality driver. So this is catchment nutrient balancing. It's a water sector initiative to engage with farmers to deliver catchment-based solutions and reduce nutrient loads to help achieve the water quality objectives. So 17 interventions have been agreed with the Environment Agency for use under catchment nutrient balancing, and they can be found on the slide at the moment. So this uses FarmScoper again. You can do the optioneering stage where you use the FarmScoper upscale to identify the water bodies in the catchment that are likely to have the highest nutrient loads. And once you've identified a landowner or farmer, you can then run FarmScoper at a farm scale to quantify reductions from the selected mitigation methods. It's important to consider that the water industry uses different models, like say the SimCat, and it's important to consider data exchange when you're working between these two models. So we tend to use the percentage reduction rather than an absolute value when talking about nutrient reductions. Nutrient load reductions. And also there are some uncertainties when it comes to FarmScoper. So there could be inaccuracies in the agricultural census data that it uses, or variability in the efficacy of the measures in the model, or efficacy of the measures when they go into the ground. So we take a Monte Carlo approach to account for that uncertainty in the outputs. Next slide, please. And then finally, from me, I am going to talk a little bit about stacking and bundling, the wonderful world. So bundling refers to multiple benefits being sold as a single credit. So some of the carbon credits are implicit bundles, which the carbon is quantified but is actually wrapped up within that credit are the other environmental benefits. And stacking refers to separating out those different ecosystem services for sale in different markets as different units. But it's important to consider when you're stacking ecosystem services additionality. And there are different types of additionality. So there is baseline additionality, so comparing a pre-project baseline to a post-project baseline, and that additional environmental benefit is the ecosystem service that you are selling. There's also legal additionality, so you're not allowed to sell the benefits for things that you are legally required to do. For instance, if a farmer has got a restocking notice to plant some trees on his land, he can't then they can't sell the carbon from those trees as they were legally required to do so in the first place. And there's also financial additionality. So if a project isn't feasible, monetarily wise, isn't feasible without extra funding from the sale of ecosystem services, you can demonstrate financial additionality through this. And these additionality tests are there to guard against double counting, selling the same benefit twice, and also looking at greenwashing and things that we really don't want to be involved with. So biodiversity net gain, there's been some guidance on stacking and biodiversity net gain. So you can stack biodiversity net gain with nutrient neutrality, but you can't stack biodiversity net gain with carbon. And this is due to them not being able to guarantee that trees and carbon lost through a development are being replaced through a biodiversity uplift. There's just no guarantees there. So they've decided you can't stack the two. It's also important to think about the quantification and the monitoring requirement. Each of these ecosystem service markets requires different quantification and different monitoring. And biodiversity net gain, you're looking at 30 years monitoring and maintenance. Nutrient neutrality is in perpetuity, so that's 80 to 100 years. So it's thinking about the capacity and the feasibility before jumping into all these agreements. We really want to think about that before we try and stack too many things. And we're also limited by the available markets, and the more these markets develop, the more guidance, the easier it's going to become. And this example on the side is just a hypothetical of how you might stack the ecosystem service benefits from a pond wetland system. So the starter for 10 would be the permanent storage in the pond itself, and that could be sold as replenished, so increasing the water quantity in the catchment, improving catchment resilience. Then added to this pond design, we put some bunded storage, so the storage between permanent and bunded, this is the flood storage. And then incorporating some design features that would improve water quality, such as increasing retention time and incorporating sediment traps. This is the additional water quality benefit that can be sold as nutrient neutrality. And then the biodiversity uplift that you get from creating a rich wetland habitat could be sold as biodiversity units. And I will now pass you over to Dan Turner, who is going to speak about the Wire project.
Thanks, Tom. And as you say, whistle stop. Just one question before we go on to Dan. There's a question here about, does nutrient neutrality mapping take things into account for such as future climate change?
It's more of a here and now, where the mitigation is going to be best placed. And then when you've identified an area or where you may be looking to maybe put, a wetland system, you can then look into how future climate change, this is more of a scoping exercise, those kind of the data that's available in the CABA data package.
Brilliant, thanks. There's one bigger question in there which you can have a look at whilst we're hearing about Dan's amazing work on the Wire.
Hi all, I'm Dan Turner, technical lead at the Rivers Trust. So as Alex says, today I'm going to talk about kind of environmental markets, but for a bit of context and a bit of kind of wider perspective of markets and opportunities it can create. Having worked for kind of a local Rivers Trust and helped run catchment partnerships for many years, delivering large-scale catchment projects was always a challenge, and ultimately was always constrained by funding or funding requirements. So market-led approaches allows us to think kind of more holistically, really, and really start to have those kind of unconstrained visions, which can be co-designed via catchment partnerships and locally owned, enabling us to create mechanisms to safeguard our catchments and landscapes for the long term. And I think catchment partnerships are, uniquely placed to develop these approaches through our networks and collaborations. So this talk is just an overview of one of those successful market-led approaches in the Upper Wire, developed by the Wire Rivers Trust, the Rivers Trust, and Triodos Bank. So if you go on to the next slide. So the Wire was one of the 4 pilot projects funded by Esme Fairbairn Foundation, DEFRA, and the Environment Agency. kind of the precursor to the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund. And it was basically looking at how we can attract private investment to help fund nature recovery at scale, and working very closely with our partners, United Utilities, Floodery, Co-op Insurance, Environment Agency, and we had some financial advice from Triodos Bank and worked closely with the Wyre Rivers Trust. So if we go on to the next slide. So why the Wyre? Well, the Wyre is located in northwest Lancashire. It drains from the Forest of Bowland and is very characteristic of many of our upland river systems. There are several flood affected communities in the catchment. Churchtown has experienced a 1 in 50 year flood event 4 times in the last 20 years, and we all know the kind of devastating impact that has on those local communities. And the economic cost alone to insurers in a 1 in 50 year flood event is estimated to be around £2 million. So go on to the next slide. So we also know that, hard engineered flood risk management solutions alone will not address our future flood risk challenges and must be supplemented with nature solutions, especially as we look at the impacts of climate change. But the mechanisms to finance the implementation of NFM at scale in the UK still remains a significant barrier to uptake. If you jump onto the next slide. So right at the start of the project, we had some hydrological modelling done, which demonstrated that 70 hectares of highly targeted NFM interventions in the upper catchment could significantly reduce flooding to Churchtown. These are, very well recognised, tried and tested NFM interventions that we've been delivering for a number of years now. So things like leak dams, ponds and scrapes, new hedgerows, low-level earth bunds, woodland creation. And these all have the ability to intercept, slow and hold water in that catchment. So if we go on to the next slide. So, but we also know that a lot of these NFM interventions also have several other benefits, and kind of Tom highlighted some of these kind of potential other ecosystem services that they deliver. So things like habitat creation, improving water quality, sequestering carbon through the peat and the tree planting, but also importantly, the social benefit and reducing those stresses and strains of flood risk to communities at risk. So if we go on to the next slide. So the real challenge in this project is how do we bring together all these various stakeholders through a revenue model and fund a large-scale restoration project. So this is a simple transactional structure, and at first glance it can seem quite complex, but I like to think of it like any other startup really that's trying to sell something but doesn't have enough upfront capital to get going. It just happens to be that the service we are selling is ecosystem services. So how we structured this, at the heart we have something called a special purpose vehicle, which will draw down external investment finance to fund the capital delivery, which will be then repaid over a 9-year period through contracts with buyers, so those that will benefit from the intervention, and sellers, farmers and landowners who will host those NFM interventions on the ground. But essentially, this is a social enterprise model. The SPV has been set up as a community interest company limited by guarantee that has an asset lock on it. So what that means is that essentially any retained profit in that entity will go towards future catchment intervention. So nobody's profiting from the scheme. It's very much set up to try and look at those win-win situations. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So I thought I'd just add some context to the previous slide and use this to kind of demonstrate how we kind of sharing risk to enable a project to work. So first, obviously brought together several buyers of ecosystem services and particularly reduce flood risk. and all of those buyers that we've brought together all, benefit from the flood risk reduction. But what that means is that each one of those buyers are paying a proportion of the costs, but receiving the whole benefit of that flood risk reduction. However, there is obviously still quite a lot of uncertainty around the effectiveness of NFM. But as a buyer of NFM, understandably, when buying a service, you want to make sure that you are getting a flood risk reduction. Therefore, all the buyer's payments are underpinned by a performance metric, i.e., if the intervention isn't reducing the desired flood risk, and the performance metric is not met, the buyers have an opportunity to review their contract, at which point the investors could potentially lose some of their capital investment. And this kind of reflects, the return of investment that the investors are putting in, and obviously that is kind of risk capital that they're putting in. As I said, the CRC has been set up as a completely separate entity, and it's represented by a board of directors, which all represent all the key stakeholders in this project. And I think this is really important, as this starts to build, trust and transparency, but also, as I said before, nobody is making profit, and it's in kind of everybody's interest to make it work. So all the capital costs are paid for by the community interest company, and the farmers are entered into an initial 9-year contract for hosting and maintaining those interventions, which is all index linked. So whatever the scenario, the farmers are always guaranteed a 9-year payment as long as the interventions are properly maintained. And I think this process allows for the payment of both the capital and long-term annual payments for the intervention, which is always something we struggle to do through traditional grant and aid funding. So therefore, as you can see, this is a kind of a debt-based model and how we've used it, and it's kind of allowed us to manage and share risk to enable a catchment scale NFM intervention, which would not kind of been achievable otherwise. And then just finally, I just thought, demonstrate some images of success. There's some of the successful projects that have been delivered. So the development of the project was successfully completed just over a year ago. The Wyre Rivers Trust have been doing a fantastic job and delivering the first year of interventions. The buyers have paid their first invoice, and the farmers have received their first hosting and maintenance instalment. If you go on to the next slide, Alex, if there is any. Yeah, I'll just quickly flip through a few of those images just to show you kind of what has been delivered. So yeah, that's it, and take any questions.
Thanks, Dan. Let's give Tom and Sarah a moment to come back. I know there's a few questions in the QA. Firstly, I'd just like to make my thanks to Dan, Tom and Sarah for doing what I think is really exceptional work. We are in what I often use terms of this is a nascent markets, and we don't yet have all the solutions, but I think we are certainly kind of developing kind of key parts of the jigsaw, and I think we've got some really good bits of this jigsaw, and there are kind of we don't yet have all the questions, or let alone all the answers, but there's some really good things here that we are going to be looking to scale and share, and hopefully wider people, others will start to adopt over time, because personally I think this is how we are going to certainly address the impact of climate change, or at least adapt to climate change. It also, despite the seeming complexity, is a much more efficient, cost-effective way of delivering environmental outcomes than we are perhaps doing at the moment. Again, before we come to questions and reflections from the team, and please put your questions into the Q&A. I think what's been really, really rewarding about this work at a number of levels over the last few years is it's the principles around it, not always be obvious, but that kind of co-funding approach, so the support from the likes of DEFRA and the EA through NERF and those activities, the work through the support through Esme Fairburn, particularly on the original kind of initial NERFs, and then the funding through businesses. that has all enabled this kind of thinking to happen and these projects to be delivered. And I don't think we should underestimate that. And that is, again, all done through the lens of catchments and catchment partnerships. And to my mind, there is this really critical need to get really, really good catchment partnership plans in place. Because if we can collaboratively identify those plans, both from the water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, and we could do that at catchment scale, that is the shop window to kind of secure that investment and drive through some of these other opportunities. But there's enough of me wittering on. I'm just wondering from Sarah and Tom or Dan, if there's any questions that you picked up in the Q&A that you want to pick up before we kind of look at the more recent ones that have come through. Definitely silence from everybody. Thanks, team.
There's the question about how's it linked with naturally and nutrient neutrality and offsetting. If it's linked, can it offset a project in neighbouring catchment? I think that is going to be something for local planning authorities who are in charge of nutrient neutralities in the different catchments. As I understand it, the mitigations have to be within the protected site, so you couldn't put mitigation somewhere completely separate. I'd be at one for the local planning authority.
Okay, thanks, Tom. A couple of questions here, Dan, that I think you're probably best placed to. So there was one question from Kate. Are payments to the farmers taken into account delivering of ecosystem services, i.e. reducing flood risk, or simply compensating for loss of which occurred when land is flooded?
Yeah, good question. Do you want me to take that on? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, so it is an ecosystem service payment. We're really keen to look at like co-design with the farmers. So in the Glendermachan, we're also working on a similar project, and what we've done in that is use the facilitation group, and actually those farmers have kind of set those prices of the different interventions. And it's been a really fascinating kind of journey we've been on with them, and they're really deeply embedded in this project. And as I said before, I think that the key principle of this is nobody's making profit out of this. So what we're trying to find really is a kind of win-win-win situation for all. So to really try and enable that kind of step change in landscape and nature recovery where kind of everybody's in it together, if you know what I mean. So hopefully that answers your question.
Great. A question from Peter here, which is quite interesting, which have you done any research into the appetite from potential buyers to invest, i.e. are you tapping into a demand or having to create a market? I might just offer some thoughts then kind of more widely. There's a lot of research going on this type of thing, Peter, across different sectors and across different initiatives. I think it's fair to say there's obviously the offset market, the supposed billions and trillions of green investment that's out there looking for a home. So I think there's definitely a market, or certainly a supposed market. Obviously bridging the gap sometimes between the rhetoric and the reality is often bleak. But what hopefully you're getting a sense from here, and Dan's alluded to particularly, is a lot of these are opportunities. It's much cheaper to do it this way than through hard engineering. And there are multiple benefits. And if you start to get multiple buyers investing in these things, they get multiple benefits at a cheaper cost than they would do by doing it themselves, perhaps through hard engineering. But I don't know if Dan or Sarah have got any particular views on that question.
Yeah, I think, you know, obviously that is a big part of these kind of projects, is understanding the appetite from buyers, and generating that revenue is really the key to a lot of these projects. And I think we want to operate in that space where it's, you know, business risk avoidance. So we're like reducing business risk, and that is, you know, that's what we spend a lot of time doing. And we try and, you know, we've tried to work kind of by bringing them into kind of a consortium of buyers, where we can find kind of common ground. I think that's the approach we've taken. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of time looking at researching, looking into business plans and trying to align priorities. But I think, you know, catchment partnerships are really well placed to do that.
And just on the replenish side, so we received the NERF funding to actually look at how we establish a replenish market that's a little bit more formal than what we've been doing already. So a lot of the water stewardship activities that we've been delivering historically, they've come around because we've got good relationships with corporates, and we've obviously been working in this space for 10 years plus with Coca-Cola. But what we wanted to do is really find out what the appetite is for further investment. And I think we've seen over the year that we've been working in this, trying to look at who are the other buyers, that's already starting to increase. And we're already seeing more and more sectors prioritizing water. So we think the demand for replenish projects will only grow.
Great, thanks, Sarah. There is a question here from an anonymous attendee, which I think relates to this question about demand in the market. It's about, have you approached or engaged with any water treatment companies for this scheme? So I think it was mentioned, I know United Utilities are one of the key people involved in the wire, but again, we're working with a lot of water companies, as are many of the people at the catchment partnerships, because again, I think water companies see the opportunities for nature-based solutions and sort of upstream solutions as opposed to downstream solutions. And this is some of these are key ways of addressing this. And I think there's a reference here to upstream thinking. Yeah, West Country Rivers Trust and the Cornwall Wildlife Trust have been leading on that project for a long time. And that's about, working with the farming community to overall reduce everyone's water bills, cost of water bills, by taking many instances sort of agricultural diffuse pollution out. So again, this is sort of an evolution of that thinking and what we're doing. Question again for Dan, I think from Ben here. Are the farmers in the wire project the landowners in this case, or tenants? And how do the payments for ecosystem services and the maintenance shared between landowners and managers? And why, I guess the other quick question is, why only for 9 years?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so there's like a dual contract with both the landowner and the tenant, but obviously the money goes to the tenant that is actually doing the work on the ground and delivering that ecosystem service. 9 years, yeah, that's a good question. So the initial 9 years is basically, after 9 years, all the basically investment, upfront capital will be repaid at that point. The annual kind of repayment structure will come down a huge amount. So the buyers would say the annual collective revenue we need from buyers is 220,000 a year, but after 9 years that goes down to around £25,000. And at that point, where we'll renegotiate a contract with the landowners to extend that at a similar rate. But just to kind of point out that all of those payments to farmers are index linked, so inflation index linked, so they go up each year in line with CPIH, which is again, something that Countryside Stewardship hasn't done. But they also, the benefit of a kind of private scheme is you can do quite interesting things with agreements, etc. So we've made it really simple for the farmers. It's a 10-page agreement. But also we've done like a £500 onboarding fee, recognizing that actually a lot of these farmers have taken time to engage with us, and that's a cost that needs covering. So every farmer, whatever you're delivering, just a hedge or a fully fledged project, get a kind of £500 onboarding fee. And as we move into further projects, we're looking at kind of potentially we could provide independent business advice if that's of interest to those farmers. So there's lots of interesting things you can do.
Good, thanks, Dan. Just kind of a prompt to everyone. We've got one or two, I think probably more like 1 minute left. So if you do have any final questions, please put them in the Q&A. An interesting question from Dave Hadley. Are there obstacles to implementing such schemes into estuaries as opposed to rivers? So a key point here, David, is, the rivers, it's done at a catchment scale. So, the rivers are medium, so it's not all around the rivers. It's very much about implementation at a catchment scale. So in that instance, estuaries are part of that whole scape process. So I think it's really important that we do look at it, the landscape. That said, I can imagine that with an estuary that there's less of a sort of circular, for want of a better term, system. So I don't actually really see there being significant differences. you'd certainly change the different buyers that you might have, and probably to a degree some of the sellers. But I think the principle is still sound. And actually, if you look at this wholescapes concept, which many people are working on, which is just source to sea. So you're taking the catchment, you're looking at the coastal side of things. I don't think there's a lot of work, certainly not that I'm aware of, that's been progressed on this front using these models, but I would hope that's only going to be a matter of time. And I know there's quite a few NERF projects in that space looking at these opportunities. Final question. Well, I'll give Dan, Tom, and Saren a moment for any final reflections before we close the call.
So just before a final reflection, I know Amanda, I think you'd asked about climate adaptation and how we make sure any projects implemented on the ground are taking into account any future rainfall patterns or any droughts, etc. And I think I'd like to say that all of the interventions that we implement are extremely well designed and thought through. So they're not just answering the current problems we're dealing with. We are forecasting what we believe is going to happen in the future, be that increased temperatures, increased rainfall, etc. And we're always mindful of the schemes to make sure that we are answering both future and historic problems.
Great. Tom?
I'll piggyback on that with the climate change theme. It's all about the design. There's been some research from the Forestry Commission on tree planting and which species that'll be a small section of the sort of BMG process. But yeah, designing for climate change is important. And I just say everyone's learning in this space, so collaborating, be it through catchment partnerships and cross-sector, cross-organisation. If we can help each other out, we're all trying to deliver like nature recovery. So yeah, help each other out through the process. Thanks.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, for me, principally, this is all about what the landscape or catchment needs. I think we need to make sure that we keep that at the forefront. That's what's driving these projects is what those catchments need, not necessarily what the buyers need. So and how we can blend all of this together to enable a step change to hopefully deliver against our kind of 25-year environmental objectives.
Brilliant. Well, on that note, I hope you've all found this helpful, useful. As I say, it's just different parts of this jigsaw that we all need to work on to address the issues with our rivers, our catchments, and ultimately our environment. So I hope you found today useful. I'd say get in touch. We're all very busy at the moment, so we've probably got limited bandwidth, but I really, really could encourage you all to work very closely with your catchment partnerships and look at how we might be able to scale some of these opportunities for the benefit of all. And on that note, I will wish you all a very happy Friday. Take care. Thank you.